Greetings, everyone. Welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. Today, we have a very special guest. Also, this is hosted by We Charge Colonialism. We have a very special guest, Milton Allimadi, who's going to come talk to us about some of the issues that African people experience as far as media coverage. This is something that many of you probably already have opinions on. Many of you have probably witnessed different false stories that have gone out or false representations of African people that have gone out. And Brother Milton has made a very, very great book called Manufacturing Hate, where he talks in depth about many different historical examples of this phenomenon. So to you, Comrade Milton, could you please introduce yourself for anyone who has not followed you thus far?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me on your wonderful show. You know, I follow you very closely. I admire the good work that you do. I'm Milton Allimadi. I publish Black Star News, blackstarnews.com. I also teach African history as an adjunct professor at John Jay College here in New York City. I host a podcast called African History Club, which is on Patreon, and also have a weekly show on WBAI 99.5 FM radio, also streaming on WBAI.org here in New York City, and it's every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Born in Uganda. I grew up partly in Uganda, in Tanzania, and then here in the United States as well, because I came here for college. I went to Syracuse. I studied economics. But, you know, all my life, I'd always been really indignant and angry by the way African people all over the world are demonized and portrayed in European media. And that is why I decided to go back to school. I went to Columbia for the Graduate School of Journalism. I became a journalist, and that's what I've been doing for almost 30 years now. So that's where I am.
So what made you want to write this book? That's something that I was wondering, exactly, like, who is your audience? Who is it that you're trying to help see the truth about how different mainstream media outlets operate?
Okay, very good. I think I wrote it for two reasons. Number one, I wrote it because of the sense of frustration that I'm sure all of us as African people feel when we read and we know we are deliberately being misrepresented or demonized in European media, by corporate media. We know it's been done because, as we know historically, demonization has always gone hand in hand with exploitation. So, for example, during the era of slavery and enslavement, you had to demonize African people and represent them as lesser than human beings. Human beings defined by Europeans. So look how different they are from Europeans. They must not be fully human beings. So therefore, enslaving them is justified. The same thing for colonialism, right? When Europeans went and partitioned Africa, they had to represent them as less than human beings to their audience back in Europe to justify the colonial conquest and domination. And then in our contemporary era, it's a little more sophisticated. So for example, rarely do you find words like primitive natives anymore. Rarely do you find words like savages anymore, which you still found in the 1960s. But now they try to use different type of representations. To a broad extent, they still use tribesmen, tribespeople. That's the closest they come now to using the term savages. So that was a frustration as early as when I was 12 years old, when I was living in Tanzania. That's when I started reading newspapers on a regular basis. I used to go to, it was called, I think, the United States Information Services, one of their many propaganda agencies all over the world. And they had publications from all over the world, including the US, of course. So I read all the US papers, all the US magazines, and then it became clear to me that African people are always depicted as lesser human beings. So that sense of frustration was the one part of the motivation. The other part, of course, was to counter them and challenge them and make it difficult for them to continue misrepresenting Africa. Because, of course, as you know, neocolonialism is just a more sophisticated form of enslavement and the traditional old school colonialism. But in order to continue even with neocolonialism, you still have to demonize to some extent. So, for example, when you see a war in the Congo, for example, it's portrayed as if these are just Congolese Africans waking up one day and deciding to become violent with each other. The part that you don't get is that European governments were actually subsidizing the governments of Uganda and Rwanda to invade the Congo multiple times. And while millions of Africans are being killed, European corporations are mining resources from Eastern Congo as this war is ongoing. Once they refer to it as tribal war, that's it. Then we don't need any other explanations. So I wanted to end that tendency as well. I think those were my two primary motivations.
You start the book off talking a lot about Libya, and I remember, being younger at that time and not having like a good understanding of what exactly was going on. All I knew that Gaddafi was this bad man, and the United States. Actually, when my teacher said that, well, we have to go in there because if not, then Gaddafi is going to commit genocide. And so you hear this very like narrowly tailored telling of the story. And then later on, I go back and I'm finding out all of this information that wasn't available. Can you just speak a little bit about like what exactly was mainstream media doing whenever the United States enforced regime change inside of the country of Libya?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that one up. Libya was the best example of how corporate media are essentially extension of Western government. And we saw that manifest in Libya. In Libya, of course, what was different between Gaddafi and the other oil-rich countries was, number one, Libya controlled its oil resources. The oil companies were Libyan oil companies. Libya was able to retain the substantial portion of the surplus, the profit from the oil, to build up Libya. In fact, many people are not aware that it was Gaddafi that helped initiate OPEC. Before then, all those countries were getting like $10, $20 a barrel. It was only when Gaddafi told them that, listen, they need these resources. So why should we allow them to dictate the price? Let's form this organization. And that's when oil started going up to $50, $100 a barrel. So he did that. And the difference between him was that, unlike you see those princes and princesses in Saudi Arabia, primarily prince, very male-dominated country, engaging in all this luxurious spending, Libya is not the case. Libya, the money was directed to the grassroots, built schools, built hospitals, built apartments. And I know this because I actually visited Libya. Ironically, just a few months before NATO unleashed this war on Libya. And I went there, and I have to admit to you that even though I feel I am relatively open-minded and I tend to be critical, even I had been to some extent influenced by the propaganda. So when I got there to Libya, obviously the government had invited me because they had seen an earlier book that I had self-published, and they read it, and they actually wanted to publish that in Arabic as well. So I was invited. But what I did was what all journalists would want to do. I waited one morning when I was in the hotel, and I left before any of the guides or minders could come because I wanted to see Libya for myself. So I went out on the streets and the whole day, and I was talking to ordinary Libyans, young Libyans, working Libyans, students, men, women. And I have to tell you, I was impressed. The women spoke about how their parents and parents' parents did not have the kind of education that they had. Free education, and they're not forced to to cover themselves if they didn't want to. I was surprised by the openness because, as I admit, I had to some extent also been influenced by the propaganda. And I would ask them about like apartments, for example, how much do they pay in rent? The apartments are free. They don't pay rent. They don't pay phone bill. They only pay for their mobile services, but landline, that is also paid for by the state. When you get married, you get a grant to start your new family. When you buy a house, you get a interest-free loan, which in most cases are also forgiven. Education free, healthcare free. I have to tell you, I was more impressed than I thought I would have been. And the best part was having seen it and spoken to people independently by myself. And that's the example that they don't want duplicated, not only in other countries, but even here in the United States. And the only way to do that was to gain control of Libya's oil. So when that opportunity started with the uprising that was going on in the other North African countries as well, and there were some protests in Benghazi, and obviously then the Western agencies took advantage of that and played it up and then used that as the pretext to invade and destroy Libya, allegedly to save Libyans from being killed by Gaddafi. So how did they do it? By bombing Libya 24/7 for several months. Up to date, we don't know how many Libyans were killed by the NATO war. We don't know the extent of the billions in damages in property and infrastructure done by this war. In fact, that is the essence of the definition of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And who will make Libya's case, I don't know. But the corporate media made the case for that war. And that's what I covered in the introduction of my book. And I also noted that we were one of the few contrarian outlets that consistently wrote editorials condemning this war, to the extent that one day we could not access our website. So you try to get on blackstarnews.com, you just keep getting these error terms. So I called our host, which is Network Solutions, and I said, what's going on? And we were told, oh, this is a technical problem. One day went by. 2 days went by. The third day, in fact, early, like around 4 a.m., I woke up and I called them again. And I said, I don't believe you. I don't believe of all the thousands and thousands of websites that you host, they're not able to access for 3 days for technical reasons. So I started taking down names. Who are you? I spoke to about 2 or 3 people. I took down their names and titles, went back to bed. When I woke up, the website was up. So now I know, okay, there's some correlation here between that call and what's going on. So I logged on the website, and sure enough, the last editorial that we wrote condemning the war, because by that time, these Western supported insurgents were targeting Libyans that looked primarily like you and I, killing them, beheading them, and posting it on YouTube. These were the so-called freedom fighters the West was backing. So I told people, call this number and ask, why are you not covering this genocide against Libyans that look like us? I gave the number for the New York Times publisher, the editor. I said, call them. Why are you not covering it? To its credit, the Wall Street Journal actually wrote about it. I gave the number for the State Department. I gave the number for the White House, for the NAACP, and for the National Urban League. That editorial had been deleted by the time our website had been restored. So now I understood the purpose for why the website had been hijacked, and then a network solution had been compelled to actually delete an article that had already been published live.
And I do want to emphasize that for people, because we were told a lot of things about Libya, but we were not told a lot of things about Libya. Yes. And one thing, there was, like you said, a genocide. Like the United States was supporting a genocide, knew that the rebels were committing this genocide against African people who were thought to be Gaddafi sympathizers, because it was just basically assumed that if you were Black inside of Libya, you must be pro-Gaddafi. And so they went out and did horrible mass atrocities targeting Black Libyans. And then look at today, what's happening. You see that Libya has become this cesspool for modern enslavement.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a lot of crazy things that aren't emphasized in the media. One question I had while reading your book was, when we have like professors and teachers tell us that there are scholarly or scholarly sources and everything, and then your book kind of paints this picture like that these sources like the New York Times, you spend a lot of time about the New York Times, about Time Magazine, a lot of these mainstream entities are very slanted. So, absolutely. And then I feel like the independent sources are never considered scholarly. So, what are the implications of this issue?
The implication is actually frightening, because this is only one book that, tries to meticulously document all this misinformation and propaganda. So what else have we been missing for decades, for centuries? Of course, we know to some extent. We know in a big way, because first of all, when I always tell my students this, any African could not possibly be made to feel inferior to any non-African, if they knew the history. If you know the history that all humanity began in Africa, obviously, for, not mysterious, that they're not taught this, right? And that the first human beings were Africans, and that had Africans not migrated to populate the rest of the world, everybody would be African. So how can you be inferior to anybody? When my students learn this basic information, it comes as a revelation to them. It really changes them. You see their spirits even change. So that's just a vast example of the kind of distortion of history and facts that we get. But in my case, you have the opportunity to walk back meticulously, to look at the New York Times, for example, in some instances, when they actually concocted incidents that never happened and inserted it into news articles and published it in the New York Times. And to many people then, and even today, the New York Times, they approach it as biblical word, as fact, as laid in stone, as something that cannot be challenged. So I didn't know that I would find some of the information that I found. Obviously, I wanted to, when I started the research, I was still doing my master's in Columbia. This is like 3 decades ago now. So I went to the New York Times archives because I know they have the longest history of coverage of not only Africa, but the world. So some of the first editorials I found were from 1877. And even then, they were already justifying conquest and colonization of Africa in that one particular editorial I found, advocating for England to go in and take control before Germany could go in. And that was an editorial in the New York Times. And then in terms of demonizing Africans, in that editorial comparing Africans to, said they were a cross between hippopotamus and crocodile. I really don't know what that means, right? And that was part of the narrative, demonize and then exploit. So that was the early representation. So let's move up all the way to the late 1950s now, when African countries are beginning to decolonize. So the New York Times sends a reporter named Homer Bigart, Bigart. Often when I say what he did, people end up saying, he should be called Homer Bigart. He had already won the Pulitzer Prize 2 times for a paper called the New York Herald Tribune before he joined the New York Times. So he was a star reporter. So they send him to Ghana to see how independence is faring in Ghana and other African countries who are lined up to get their independence. So he writes a letter from Accra to his foreign news editor here in New York. And I'm paraphrasing, but he's saying, I cannot get this enthusiastic about these so-called emerging republics. The leaders are either witch doctors or sorcerers. Says people like Kwame Nkrumah, and he's not impressed with them. He says, I pretty much prefer the primitive bush people because after all, cannibalism is the best antidote to this so-called population explosion that everybody's complaining about. So you might say, okay, this could be one deranged racist reporter. But then I went to see what was published that he wrote from Africa at that time. And there was a perfect correlation between the views he expressed in these private letters and what ended up being published in the New York Times. One article, he's talking about independence of the Congolese. And he says to the pygmies in the forest, independence means now they can have more meat, more beer, more salt, and basically just ridiculing the notion of independence, going along with the Belgian narrative, of course. Belgium, the colonial power, was saying basically these folks don't deserve independence. They're too backward, they're too primitive, they need us Europeans to stay on. And the New York Times is adopting that same narrative. Now, let me show you 2 examples of how malicious it was done. In one of his letters, Bigart complained that he could not find pygmies to interview as to what independence meant to them. But by the time his letter is published, article is published in the New York Times, he's now stating that, pygmies are saying independence means more beer, more salt, more meat. That's one example. In a second example, and this to me was the strongest, to really indict them on how malicious they were in terms of their racism. I found a letter written by a reporter named Lloyd Garrison, who was sent to Nigeria to cover the civil war there when Biafra was trying to break away from the Federation. And he sent a letter complaining to his editors here in New York. This is around 1966, I believe, who inserted that reference into his article talking about Nigerians dressed in grass leaves. So imagine, this is one of their own reporters sent to Africa, and now he's reading his own article, and he's reading about how he wrote about Nigerians dressed in grass leaves, when in fact he did not write it. But the editor sitting here in New York said, no, this article is not quote unquote savage enough, so we have to spice it up. And they put that reference into that article, which shows not just ignorance, but beyond animus toward Africans and malice, in fact. In fact, many people, when they hear this account, have asked me, they get so angered. Is there a way to take legal action against the New York Times for not only perpetuating, but actually being involved in manufacturing these racist tropes and narratives?
Yes, absolutely. We have a good question. You kind of touched on this, I remember, in the book. It says, as come about the U.S. using the CIA agent Paul Kagame to destabilize Congo for minerals to the West with his companion Museveni. I know you spent a lot of time talking about the issue of how the Tutsis were favored by the West, and they were depicted so favorably, and that really led directly to the genocide in Rwanda. But also afterwards, Kagame becomes a hero of the West.
Absolutely. And that continues up today because they make billions of dollars out of that. There's the United Nations listed many of these Western companies, American companies, Canadian companies, European companies, who are making billions of dollars over these years, even as the body count just keeps piling up in Eastern Congo. And Museveni and Kagame were celebrated whenever they come to the West. They would be invited and met by senior officials. Museveni used to go to the White House on a regular basis, and they were treated like the darlings of the West, when in fact, they are the agents of imperialism and corporate genocide in the Congo. But it's not surprising. Mobutu was sustained and celebrated, while Patrice Lumumba was murdered by the CIA and the Belgians and the British, and they installed Mobutu and sustained them for 37 years. So it's not surprising. That's what they've done historically. So Museveni and Kagame are the Mobutu of the 21st century. It's not by accident that Thomas Sankara, who's advocating for Africa to unite, to use its resources to build a wealth in Africa, they are eliminated, they are executed or overthrown, as in the case with Kwame Nkrumah. It's not by accident. While the ones like the Musevenis, the Kagames, and the Mobutus are the ones who are sustained for decades. But when the corporate media write about it, they write about it as if this is only a purely African problem. Yes, it is it's an African problem, but it's not a purely African problem, because Africans have been engaged in struggle. As we know, Africans fought and they overthrew white European racist colonialism in Mozambique, in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau, in what was Rhodesia. So Africans are capable of fighting. They went to the bush and they fought guerrilla wars. But who was the one backing the wrong side throughout that period? It was the West, the Western governments providing them diplomatic cover, providing them with military weapons, and the corporations with business dealings as usual. So we have to always emphasize that and expose the Western corporate media's role in shielding this part of the narrative.
I want to read a quote from the book. I thought this was very fascinating. You spoke about how there was a man named Keith Richburg. He was an African-American reporter with the newspaper, and that was with the Washington Post. He wrote about his experience in Africa. It was an article called "A Black Man in Africa." I'm just going to read some of how he described his feelings. He was discolored. He saw discolored, bloated bodies floating down a river in Rwanda and Tanzania. He recalled his revulsion and sorrow and pity he felt for the victims of the massacres. He had spoken about how he, essentially being a Black man, how glad he was that he was Caribbean, that he was rescued from Africa. Very self-hating narrative, obviously.
Yes.
Do you feel people of African descent, period, utilize inside of the media to sell these points of Africa being a backward society?
Right. Well, first of all, let's deal with the case of Keith Richburg. I really felt sorry for him because this is really a disturbed human being. His mind is not healthy. To say that when he saw the bodies of the victims of the Rwanda genocide, he said to himself, he thanked the Lord and said, thereabout for the grace of God go I. However, I was lucky and blessed that my ancestors were kidnapped into slavery. First of all, it shows a profound lack of knowledge of what slavery was all about. But since most of us know, we don't need to go through that narrative. That's for him to learn. But also, he revealed that his psychosis actually started from a very early age, as I also write about. When he was growing up, his parents used to tell him to avoid Black people who were more richly melanated. They didn't put it that way. It said dark. It said keep away from them. The ones with nappy hair, the ones that didn't mow their lawns and all that. He said, as his father would have said, he would have called them the N-word. That's what his father used to call them, while the others, such as his family, were good colored folk back in the day. And unfortunately, that kind of tendency is pervasive. And we can understand why, because of the narratives of historical demonization of Africa. It affects Africans all over the world, on the continent and in diaspora as well. As recent as just a few years ago, we were still having the Tarzan movie being made. Think about that. Tarzan movie being made in the 21st century. And many of us actually, of course, not me, we pay our money to go and see this kind of film. Our self-demonization, we are contributing to it. How can we tolerate this? So it's not surprising that you would find a mindset like a Keith Richburg. But as I also wrote in the same chapter, this kind of sickness that Richburg demonstrated, Malcolm X had addressed. In fact, he addressed it in a speech less than 2 weeks before he was assassinated in Detroit. And if people go on YouTube and if you put, you can't hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree, you'll see a clip to a 6-minute audio and you'll listen to him speaking. And he said, during the period of European colonial rule in Africa, they represented Africa as backward, as jungle, as savages, as cannibals. So it was not surprising that you and I, he's referring to himself, of course, you and I wanted nothing to do with Africa, let alone have anybody refer to us as African. We ended up hating our nose, the shape of our nose, the shape of our lips. We wanted, as he put it, long dog-like noses. We ended up hating the color of our skin. Everything about us seemed to be holding us back. And quite frankly, you can't hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree itself. So he said, unconsciously, we ended up hating ourselves. So Malcolm understood this. And of course, Frantz Fanon has written very well, superbly about this in Black Skin, White Mask. And I also discuss a little bit of that in the book as well. And it's all done with one agenda: weaken the cohesiveness of African communities globally. And that's why it was very challenging for Nkrumah, for people like Malcolm, to consummate that kind of relationship that they wanted to do relative to Africans on the continent and Africans in diaspora. Because Malcolm saw that as the key to economic and political liberation. And he was very astute and very smart in that sense. For example, Malcolm wanted the issue of racist discrimination and Southern atrocities against African people in this country to be taken before the United Nations. because it says you can't take the case, before the criminal and allow him to be the judge. So he wanted to take it away from a civil rights issue into a human rights issue. And he knew that African leaders, by virtue of their countries being members of the United Nations, could take it before the UN. And that's why he went to Cairo for the Organization of African Unity meeting in 1964. That's the organization that preceded the African Union. And he met many African leaders. He met Gamal Nasser, who was a really revolutionary socialist Libyan, Egyptian president at that time. He met Milton Obote of Uganda. He met Kwame Nkrumah. He met Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and other Kenyan officials like Tom Mboya. He met Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. He met Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. He met many of these leaders. And he was on to really revolutionizing the relations between Africans on the continent and Africans in diaspora. And I believe, obviously, we know now that he was being monitored very closely by that time by the FBI within the US, and during his travels abroad by US diplomats in all those countries, because they also saw the danger of the racist policies within the United States, the internal colonialism being taken before the United Nations. And of course, that is why ultimately Malcolm was eliminated, regardless of who actually pulled the trigger.
Right. I'm going to go to the Black Knowledge page on Facebook. This is a question. It says, there's a genocide actively going on in Nigeria, and the West are turning a blind eye to it. Basically, the U.S. and British government are aware because they've enforced amalgamation, I hope I pronounced that right, of 20 plus million people who are independently a country of their own. Yoruba Nation do you think there is a correlation between this topic discussed and what is actively presently inside of Nigeria? Do you know of? I'm not aware of this.
It's not only Nigeria, by the way. It's the entire African continent. In most cases, and this is the distinction between this imperialism independence of the United States. You can critique it justly so, that U.S. Is basically an imperial corporate capitalist power, correct? But it set up the imperialism, the corporate structure in this country after defeating the British. So they set it on their own terms. However wrong it has been, however false the promises of the Constitution of the United States was and still is today. But you have, in the case of many African countries, independence was negotiated. So in most cases, the leading African elite of the day flew to London to negotiate. Most of them are familiar with what's called Lancaster House. That is the building, the establishment in Britain, where independence for dozens of African countries were negotiated. So you are negotiating with the former colonial power. What do you think the outcome is going to be? Obviously, it's not going to be your vision of the state or the nation that you want to follow post-colonialism in Africa. And that has been a problem. And that is why we see that we don't have isolated political upheavals in African countries, but it's pervasive, meaning the problem is pervasive. And to me, the problem goes back to the narrative that started immediately after so-called independence. Most of these countries are independent on paper alone. The economy is controlled by the IMF and the World Bank, which, of course, are controlled by the United States. If you don't control your economy, how can you call yourself really independent? Would the United States or Britain wait for some bank establishment to determine how much loans it would get and what it should do with those loans and what it should implement in terms of its budget? That is not independence. So why do African countries even call themselves independent? So that is the crisis. So in Nigeria, all the Nigerian people should come together, whether from the north, whether Yoruba, whether Igbo, and map out in a conversation Nigerians, intelligent folks, there are millions of intelligent Nigerians. They can discuss what kind of vision, what kind of nation they want for themselves, not the one which was imposed by the departing colonial power and has been operated by a successive part of the African elite in Nigeria. And that is also the same case for whether it's Ghana, whether it's Uganda, whether it's Kenya, you name it, any African country. A few of the African countries were in a unique position to do it a bit differently. And those were the countries that actually took up arms and fought and won, defeated the Europeans. And now they could set up the kind of vision that they wanted. And that was Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau. But even in all these three cases, they were undermined. They counter-revolutionaries were financed and supported by the West. So let's look at one country, for example. In Angola, after the Portuguese were defeated by the MPLA, the United States supported UNITA under Jonas Savimbi, financed by the CIA, financed by South Africa, in a destructive war that went on for years. And in fact, had it not been the intervention of Cuba and Fidel Castro sending tens of thousands of troops, that revolution would have been reversed. It would have been like installing the Contras in power in Angola. And the same thing in Mozambique. They supported Renamo. And destructive war, not even attacking government soldiers, attacking civilians, destroying buildings, infrastructure, uprooting rail lines. And this was financed by the West. So those countries, also even those countries, ultimately, they were also brought to kneel down. And now they also are sponsored by the IMF and the World Bank. So I submit that African countries are actually still fighting for independence. I think younger Africans are a bit more savvy now. And once they succeed in removing the current, the bourgeois elite in African countries, I think they'll have a better chance at negotiating a brighter future for Africa. And let me give you one example. However anyone feels about China, China now, to a great extent, determines its own destiny. And it's not by surprise that China has now become a global power. Many people are not aware that in 1960, the per capita income of Ghana was more than double that of China. China was around $90 or so income per head. Ghana's was almost $200. That's very recently in historical times. But today, look at where Ghana is and look at where China is. And Ghana is one of the better performing African countries. What did China do? China kicked out imperialism, the Western manipulation of its politics and economics, and took control of its resources and guided those resources to build up China. So there's hope, because that gives the clear indication that if African countries were to succeed in doing that, it means within a couple of decades, the resources that Africa contains can also be used to build up African countries.
It's also another question I feel relates to what you were just saying. He says, if he believes there is another Thomas Sankara or Queen Nzinga out there to pick up the baton, or if he doesn't want to say because of CIA, I fully understand. I feel like, I feel like a lot of it, though, is not so much the individuals, but the environment existing that allows for a revolution.
Right. But what I like is that you see in many West African countries now, the young people are really coming out the streets. They know what's going on. They're conscious. They know to what extent French colonialism still continues in Africa. A couple of months ago, when they had protests in Senegal, they were actually specifically targeting French businesses. So that's a clear indication. I think even France is getting the message now. It's been talking about restructuring this domination of the West African currencies. So when they start talking consciously about that, it means they also see the writing is on the wall. So I'm very encouraged when I see young people taking up activism and really coming out to the streets. The same thing in South Africa. Had it not been for the economic freedom fighters, the party of Julius Malema, the ANC would not be talking about the need to return the land to Africans. For the first time, the ANC started talking about it after Malema was saying, our ancestors, they did not buy this land from our ancestors. Our ancestors, they committed genocide against our ancestors and then took over the land. So why are we even negotiating for this land? The land must be returned. The same thing is happening in Namibia, where the land situation is the same. The former European ruling class still control the bulk of the land. In South Africa, more than 70% of the land still controlled by Europeans who make up less than 8% of the population. So I see change happening in Africa, but it's still painful when you see Africans drowning in the Mediterranean, making desperate attempts to make it to Europe, when in fact, Europe is growing its economy by using the resources in Africa. That is the most painful contradiction. And that to me is the most decisive indictment of the failure of the ruling class in Africa in the 21st century.
And everyone, also on Friday morning, I'll be interviewing some Namibian activists. So definitely catch that one. It's a really telling situation of what has happened there and what continues to happen. A quick question someone wants to know, is your book in French also?
No, I'm very interested, of course, in having it translated into French. If anybody has any connection with good publishers in France, of course, my email is my first initial and my last name, so it's mallimadi@gmail.com. Be in touch with me. Obviously, the plan is to indeed have it translated into French and other language. There's a Turkish university publisher has gotten in touch and does want to translate it into Turkish.
Okay, so many good questions. Someone, let me pull it up. He says, does he feel that Israel's entry into the AU was well for Africa?
Was it what for Africa?
I'm sorry, I'll post it right back. That Israel's entry into the African Union bodes well for Africa.
No, of course not. It does not bode well for Africa. And it was done to weaken the unified African stand in support of the Palestinian cause. And obviously, I'm encouraged to see that countries like South Africa have come out to denounce this in very strong language. Botswana put out a press release saying Botswana categorically disassociates itself with this decision. It wants nothing to do with it, does not want to be a part of it. South Africa has asked for Musa Mahamat Faki, who is the chairperson of the African Commission at the African Union, to hold a meeting with all the leaders of African countries and explain this decision. This was not something that was voted on by all African countries or the leaders. It was a decision made by Musa Faki, whose title as the chairperson is equivalent of what would be the Secretary General of the United Nations. There is considerable pressure. I would not be shocked if this decision is reversed. But of course, in recent years, Israel has been extending its tentacles into the African continent, working with countries like Uganda, like Rwanda, providing them with financing, with weapons and intelligence to monitor its opposition. And that is one of the reasons why Israel had been able to succeed in building support amongst these ruling elite in some African countries, and ended up with that decision of July 22nd to admit Israel as an observer a member, which of course is completely, profoundly painful when you think of the fact that Haiti, which is an African country in the Western Hemisphere, was denied membership by the same African Union. It's completely mind-boggling and preposterous, but at the same time, is not surprising. I looked up the stats. I could not find more recent ones, but I saw that by 2016, 60% of the budget of the African Union was financed primarily by the Western countries. So if your budget is financed by the West, then we can expect that this is not the African Union that Kwame Nkrumah or Julius Nyerere would have envisioned, or Sekou Touré or Patrice Lumumba. The African Union that they envisioned was the one that actually worked on behalf of Africa and unified Africa. Because as Nkrumah said in this book, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, the only way we can protect our resources and protect it from invasions, protect it from assassinations, is by uniting. Otherwise, we won't be powerful enough to resist the Western neocolonialism.
There's another interesting question. It says, ask him, how can we stop the miseducation of African people globally? I was also wondering, in relation to this question, what do we do with these mainstream media outlets? Some people might say, oh, just try to join into them and change the narrative. But I noticed that you have started an independent newspaper outlet. Yeah. So should African people be completely doing away with their reverence for the mainstream media?
Right. We have to do both. We have to build our own media platforms. We really do. We need to, and we're having a platform such as yours, for example. We're having this discussion, very powerful. And now with modern technology, we can disseminate very widely this kind of information. So we need to build ours. That goes without any question. But at the same time, we need to challenge them. We need to expose the corporate media outlets and expose their harm and their culpability in the historical destruction of our people and our nations and the continuing process even today in the 21st century. So we should not allow any of them to get away with referring to the invasion of the Congo by these corporate puppets, Museveni and Kagame, as a quote unquote tribal war in Africa. That's very easy to expose and to embarrass them, to expose them widely and to make it very clear and make it difficult for them to continue that narrative. I would like to say that I've observed that through the years, the New York Times very infrequently now uses the terms tribesmen or tribal or tribe in reference to any story dealing with Africa. I don't think it's just by some coincidence, because even after when I wrote my paper, of course, it was a challenge getting it published. That's a whole story in itself. But I made sure that I sent copies of the paper that was the beginning of what resulted in this book. So when I was still at Columbia, I sent it to the New York Times. And through the years, I would write to the editors there. I would write to the journalist. I would write to the publisher complaining about if an African story was distorted or when they were still using tribal and tribesmen. And I have to say, I noticed that after a while, it started fading. I don't know if those kind of engagement had played a direct role, but I'm happy to say that nonetheless, I see that it has faded or perhaps even disappeared. So this to me is an example that by engaging them, when we know that they engage in wrongdoing, that can yield some outcome as well. I mean, I know that obviously somebody was concerned by the editorials we were writing about Libya, to take over control of our website, for 3 whole days. And we're not a corporate entity. We're not like a multi-million-dollar operation. But because of the platform of the internet, we were able to publish ideas and question the establishment. And the big guys found that disturbing enough to hijack our website. And we just posed a simple question. We said, these insurgents, these so-called freedom fighters supported by your taxpayer dollars are killing Africans that look like this, cutting their heads and posting it on YouTube. How can we support this? So call the White House and ask this basic question. And that question, somebody was afraid enough of that question to block our website. So I say this to give you an example of how individually and collectively we can also play agency in these changes. We shouldn't just sit back and say, oh, they're too big. This is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. They're too big. Nothing can be done. Not in the modern era. In the past, when they monopolized all ways to disseminate information, it was a challenge. It was a challenge. I'm talking about my book today in the 21st century because we now have this platform on the internet. When I started the research or did the paper at Columbia in 1992, I did not have this opportunity. Otherwise, I would have come on a show similar to this and said, listen, I dug up this information about the role the New York Times played in the racist portrayal of Africa to promote the agenda of colonialism. And now the publication was called Columbia Journalism Review. He invited me to submit it. They wanted to publish it, and then they backed out. And I found out why they backed out, because I got a copy of their edited version, and they had inserted on my behalf without my not. Listen to this. Part of the critique that I wrote was complaining about how the New York Times inserted stuff on behalf of journalists that did not happen, right? And now they invite me to publish it, and on my paper they inserted on my behalf that this essay is not criticism of the New York Times, not an indictment of the New York Times. It's just to show you how any media can go astray, because after all, the New York Times has written insightful articles about Africa. They wrote all these words on my behalf. And even after that, they decided not to publish the paper. Now, if this platform existed at that time, of course, I would have come on, I would have discussed it, I would have put pressure on them, and somebody might have published that paper. But the technology keeps changing, and technology will catch up with the good fight. So I think so long as we engage in the good fight, technology will catch up with us, knowledge will catch up with us, and we will get support and we will succeed in the long run. We have one thing that is in our favor. Some of them, I'm sure, would wish that African people could just disappear from the face of the earth, and the continent with all its resources could be left for non-Africans. But they failed to do that. Africans are here. Africans continue to multiply in number, and the resources are going to remain there. We just need to open up our minds, unlock our minds, decolonize our minds, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o said in his book. Once we do that, then I can see a better path for Africans everywhere.
There's so many questions. Everyone, I did post Comrade Milton's email inside of the chat. So if you didn't get to your question today, please do email him. I do want to say, and I also posted the link to the book. Again, it's Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. I posted the link from Amazon. My last question is, whenever we see
and also one other thing, if people want, they can also, I think, buy it cheaper from the publisher directly. Amazon. I noticed Amazon is like kicking up the price by $10. So the publisher is Kendall Hunt Publishing Company.
Oh, and so it's on audio ebook too, then, right?
Yes, it's also on ebook if you go to the publisher.
Okay, so I saw that question. So there you go. One thing I always wonder, though, whenever we find these things out, whether it's New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, whatever, why do you think they're pushing these narratives? Like, for example, you talked about how coming into the 90s, there was this big movement of people basically arguing to recolonize Africa. Are the journalists just white supremacist imperialists, or are they being pushed by someone who we don't see behind the scenes? Like, what is your theory on that?
Given what I saw with the war on Libya, to a great extent, the relationship between corporate media and government is very insidious, even much more so than many of us had suspected, And that plays a key role, really, that the State Department could just perhaps call up some editor at the New York Times or the publisher and get them to go along with that narrative. And the journalists, they talk this mantra about objectivity and all that, but they don't really internalize and think about it deeply. which is very unfortunate. They just parrot it really mechanically. I saw a reporter from the BBC who was interviewing the late John McCain before the Western invasion of Libya. This is supposed to be a reporter, and asked McCain, says, "So, Senator, when are we going to go in there?" Just think about that. For the BBC, if it was somebody from the Black Star, they would say, see these African journalists, they're not really professional journalists, saying how can we go in there? And he's supposed to be a journalist. That's what we would say. But when a BBC reporter says that, we don't say, see, this is not a real reporter. Look at this European reporter. He's a part of the government. They're working cahoots. We don't see that because for many years, we've been deluded and deceived into thinking they're really quote unquote objective. They're not. So we have to disabuse ourselves of that notion that they are objective. They serve the interest of the government, and the government serves the interest of the corporations in these countries. And they work for corporate media. So obviously they're going to support corporate interests. That is why it's not a coincidence that most of them would oppose Cuba and write critically about Cuba, because Cuba has made a decision to build a socialist nation in Cuba. So automatically, journalists that are Western corporate oriented are going to take a hostile position against Cuba. But they see nothing wrong with a country like Uganda or Rwanda, where the leadership abused the people, where there's political repression, political murder, mass killings. That's fine. So long as they preach the corporate mantra in those countries, so long as they're cool with the White House, they're cool with the State Department, they're cool with the World Bank, they're cool with the IMF, no problem. Cuba could change overnight and become a Western darling. If Cuba were to say, yes, IMF, come in. Yes, World Bank, come in. Then there would be no problem with Cuba.
Well, I hope you all learned a lot about how the media really can't be trusted. And as I've heard some of the people say, it really is like the fourth branch of the United States government.
Absolutely.
Yes. So thank you so much for coming on. Anytime in the future you ever want to come on, you're always welcome to come back.
I'm at your call. Absolutely, 100%. And I also posted, by the way, the link to the publisher. If people want
let me put that inside of the meeting.
Avoid Amazon.
Yes, everyone avoid Amazon. I should have asked you that.
Oh, no, it's all good because some people only can order from Amazon in other parts of the world. So I understand.
Right. But again, everyone, Manufacturing Hate, great read. A lot of information. So everyone, please support. And thank you again for coming on. I will see everyone inside of the next broadcast.
Thank you, sister. Keep up the good work. Peace and blessings. A luta continua.